December 26, 1944. Morning arrives shrouded in dense fog at the base of Monte Belvedere. The mountains of northern Italy felt cold and unwelcoming, their slopes slick with ice and hidden dangers. Across the valley, German commander Heinz Müller peered through his binoculars, scanning for movement in the gray light. His orders were clear: hold the Gothic line at any cost, repel the Americans no matter who they sent. Reports from headquarters claimed the enemy on this sector was the 92nd Infantry Division, black soldiers, regarded by both German and American officers as unfit for real combat. Müller recalled the dismissive laughter in the officers' mess the night before, men mocking the idea of Negro troops making any impact on a fortified mountain. Propaganda had made them feel safe. Even the most cautious among them believed the Americans had assigned this attack to men they considered expendable.
On the American side, the mood was sober but determined. Soldiers of the 370th Regiment tightened the straps of their packs, checked weapons, and exchanged silent glances in the dark. They moved in disciplined silence, weighed down not only by equipment, but by the invisible burden of expectation. Every step forward carried the hopes and anxieties of families far away, families who knew their sons were fighting not just an enemy, but the prejudices of their own army. For these men, the journey up Monte Belvedere meant more than a tactical objective. The mountain loomed ahead as a test of courage and dignity, its cliffs and ravines a gauntlet set by men who doubted them. Each soldier understood that to falter would mean confirming every insult, every slight, every policy that had kept them apart. As first light crept over the peaks, the Americans advanced. They stepped into an arena where failure was expected and success would be doubted or ignored. The German positions were silent but watchful, machine guns set and artillery waiting for targets. Both sides held their breath, one side expecting an easy morning, the other knowing it had everything to prove.
Within the mist and the biting wind, a new chapter of the war began. The laughter and arrogance of the night before had no place here, only the quiet determination of men who refused to let the world define them. The dawn was distant and cold, but the resolve burning in the hearts of the 92nd Infantry Division could not be seen through any field glass. Long before the 92nd Infantry Division saw the icy slopes of Italy, their war had started at home. When the division was activated at Fort Huachuca in the Arizona desert, segregation was not just a rule, but a way of life. Black soldiers were assigned separate barracks, ate at different tables, and trained under the watchful eyes of white officers, many of whom came from southern states steeped in Jim Crow laws. These officers rarely hid their skepticism. More often, they voiced it, directly, predicting that black troops would falter under fire.
The training itself was grueling and unforgiving. Arizona's heat pressed down on the men during long marches and weapons drills, with temperatures soaring over 110 degrees. The division was equipped with aging World War I rifles, battered trucks, and limited ammunition. Requests for better gear were usually denied or delayed, with priority going to all-white units elsewhere. The message was unmistakable. These men were not expected to be heroes. They were expected to struggle. For Private First Class Vernon Baker and his peers, every day felt like a test they were set up to fail. Some officers made it clear they expected us to fall apart. Baker later recalled, "So we trained twice as hard just to get half the credit." The men bonded over shared hardship, knowing that excellence would be their only defense against contempt. The pressure to succeed came not only from the chain of command, but also from the hopes of black communities across America.
Outside the base, discrimination followed them into daily life. Nearby towns enforced strict racial segregation, refusing service to black soldiers in restaurants, stores, and hotels. Bitter irony marked the landscape. German prisoners of war, captured on distant battlefields, often enjoyed more freedom in these towns than the very men fighting to liberate Europe. The contradictions burned, deepening the soldiers' sense of injustice. Even mail and news from home offered little relief. Letters from family brought stories of discrimination, violence, and struggle. Black newspapers printed the names of sons and brothers drafted into the army, urging them to represent their race with dignity and courage. But each story of hope was shadowed by reminders that service overseas would not shield them from prejudice when they returned. The burden of color grew heavier as deployment approached. Commanders gave pointed warnings. If the 92nd failed in Italy, every black unit's reputation would suffer for years. The soldiers understood the stakes. They carried not only their own futures, but the dreams of a generation longing for respect and equality. By the summer of 1944, the division shipped out for Europe with little fanfare. White officers kept their distance, and promotions for black soldiers were slow to come. Still, pride simmered beneath the surface. The men adopted the buffalo insignia, a nod to the frontier buffalo soldiers, hoping to reclaim some measure of historic valor denied them in the present. Upon arrival in Italy, the pattern of segregation continued. The 92nd was often given support roles, patrolling quiet sectors or digging trenches rather than participating in direct combat. Orders from high command reflected persistent doubts about their abilities. Many sensed they would only be given a real chance in the war's most dangerous moments, when the risks outweighed the doubts.
Yet this burden also became a source of resolve. The men of the 92nd learned to draw strength from adversity, finding unity in shared struggle. They knew that on the battlefield, every step forward was a step toward something greater than themselves, a claim on dignity, a fight for recognition, and a defiance of every system that told them they did not belong. The Gothic line was more than a line on a map. It was a sprawling web of defenses built to be unbreakable. Stretching for 200 miles across the Apennine Mountains, it was dotted with bunkers, trenches, and thousands of yards of barbed wire. German engineers had spent years perfecting every position, studying the terrain and registering every approach with artillery. No Allied force had yet managed to break through its western flank.
Monte Belvedere stood at the center of this fortress network, its summit rising steeply above the valleys below. The mountains themselves became a weapon, turning every assault into a climb through mud, snow, and tangled undergrowth. On maps, the slopes looked steep. In reality, they were brutal, often reaching angles that left even mountain goats struggling for purchase. For any attacker, the first step meant exposure to machine guns, mortars, and deadly anti-personnel mines. The weather turned the ground into a treacherous obstacle. December rains mixed with melting snow, churning the trails into rivers of mud. Night after night, freezing temperatures stiffened uniforms and numbed fingers. Men slipped and fell on rocks glazed with ice, their equipment heavy with frost. Many soldiers fell ill with trench foot or pneumonia before ever seeing the enemy. German soldiers manned the fortifications with confidence. They trusted the strength of their positions, and Nazi propaganda had convinced them that the 92nd Infantry Division would never pose a serious threat. Officers joked that black troops would turn back at the first burst of gunfire if they even reached the wire at all. Overconfidence bred carelessness in some sectors, as the defenders expected the fight to be brief and one-sided. Allied commanders recognized the danger and the urgency. With each passing week, winter deepened, threatening to bring the front to a halt. Supplies of ammunition and food were stretched thin, and air support was limited by poor weather. The 92nd received less than half of the artillery support given to other units, forced to make do with what they had. Their attack would not follow the ideal doctrine of overwhelming numbers, but would rely on grit and determination.
Every detail of the attack plan reflected these constraints. Night movement became a necessity, as American forces tried to close the distance before dawn could reveal them. Soldiers trained for weeks to navigate in silence, memorizing the shape of the land and the location of every ravine. Each platoon learned to carry extra Bangalore torpedoes for cutting through the deep, tangled wire that protected the ridges. Morale was fragile, but determined. Leaders reminded their men that success would mean more than victory in one battle. It would be a blow against the prejudice that had dogged their every step since enlistment. The challenge ahead was not only the German guns, but the weight of every doubt ever cast upon them. On the eve of the assault, the valley was silent, except for the distant sound of artillery. Men tried to rest.
knowing the hours before dawn would demand all their strength. Some wrote final letters home, uncertain if they would ever be sent. Others checked and rechecked their equipment, knowing that a single forgotten item could mean death in the chaos of attack. When the signal finally came, the men of the 92nd moved out under cover of darkness. The climb was slow, the ground slick with mud and ice, but no one hesitated. The chasm between them and the enemy was not just physical. It was the sum of every barrier they had faced since the day they first wore a uniform. Now, the only way forward was up, toward the ridgeline that had to be taken at any cost. Each soldier understood the price of failure. There would be no easy retreat, no forgiveness from history. The chasm and the ridge were both obstacle and opportunity, a crucible that would test the limits of courage, endurance, and hope. In the darkness before dawn, the men of the 370th Infantry Regiment gathered at the base of Monte Belvedere. Each soldier knew his assignment by heart. The plan was simple, but execution would demand every ounce of strength in courage. They would climb steep, frozen slopes under cover of night, hoping to breach the German wire before the enemy could react. As the clock struck 0600, Allied artillery thundered to life, pounding the German positions for 15 intense minutes. The barrage was meant to soften the defenses and mask the Americans' approach. When the guns fell silent, a tense hush settled over the mountains. Then came the signal, "Move out." Soldiers rose from cover, clutching their weapons tightly, and began the arduous ascent. The first few yards were the most perilous. The slope was so steep that men had to use their hands to steady themselves, clinging to roots and rocks slick with ice. Heavy packs and equipment dragged at their shoulders. Each step upward felt like a battle against the mountain itself. Yet no one dared hesitate. To stop was to become a target for the German machine guns waiting above.
The enemy's response was swift and ferocious. MG-42s opened up with a roar, spraying bullets in deadly arcs across the slope. Men dropped instantly, some wounded, others scrambling for any depression or outcropping that could provide cover. The air filled with the sounds of ricocheting metal, shouts, and the muffled blasts of grenades exploding along the wire. Despite the chaos, the Buffalo soldiers pressed forward. Fire teams leapfrogged one another, providing covering fire as others crawled ahead. At 0647, combat engineers reached the German wire, dragging heavy Bangalore torpedoes into position. Explosions ripped open gaps in the defenses, but German defenders countered with grenades and concentrated fire. The air stank of cordite and mud as men rushed through the breaches, fighting desperately to gain a foothold. In the northwest, Company B tackled the most treacherous section, a sheer rock face considered impassable by German commanders. Under cover of darkness, they climbed with ropes and sheer determination, surprising the defenders. By 0715, the first Americans reached the summit ridge. Their position was precarious, exposed on three sides, but they held fast, refusing to give ground despite mounting casualties.
German commanders, stunned by the unexpected breach, threw elite assault troops into immediate counterattack. The fighting became savage and personal. Rifle butts, entrenching tools, and even bare hands became weapons as ammunition ran low. Amid swirling fog and smoke, men struggled for every yard, each side unwilling to yield. Acts of individual heroism marked the morning. Sergeant Reuben Rivers, already wounded, charged into enemy fire to rally his platoon, holding a critical position until he fell. Others followed his example, risking everything to protect their brothers in arms. By 8:30, the battered remains of Company B still held the summit, having repelled multiple German attacks. Casualties mounted with every hour. The slopes were littered with the fallen, both friend and foe, while medics worked frantically to save the wounded under fire. Food and water ran dangerously low, and ammunition stocks dwindled, but retreat was never an option. The Buffalo soldiers' determination only hardened as the day wore on.
Throughout the day and into the night, fresh attacks came and were beaten back. The Americans dug shallow trenches and used shattered rocks for cover. grimly determined to hold their gains. Communication with rear elements was sporadic, but word filtered through. The 92nd had done what others could not. When the smoke cleared, the Americans still held Mont Belvedere. The cost was staggering. Whole platoons reduced to a handful of survivors, but they had accomplished what many believed was impossible. In the battered faces of the men who stood atop the ridge, there was no triumphalism, only the heavy realization of what their sacrifice had achieved. The laughter that had once echoed through the German bunkers was gone. In its place was a grudging respect and the bitter understanding that the Buffalo Soldiers had proved themselves in the crucible of battle.
The victory at Monte Belvedere did not end the ordeal for the 92nd Infantry Division. Instead, it marked the beginning of a relentless push deeper into the German defensive lines. Ahead stood Monte Castello, an even more formidable position, reinforced by fresh troops and heavy artillery. The winter had only grown harsher, with icy winds whipping across the ridgelines and snowdrifts piling deep along the narrow approaches. For the Buffalo Soldiers, exhaustion and loss became daily companions, but retreat was never considered. Recognizing the scale of the challenge, Allied commanders assigned the 442nd Regimental Combat Team to support the assault. The 442nd was composed almost entirely of Japanese-American soldiers, men fighting to prove their loyalty to a nation that still held many of their families in internment camps back home. The addition of the 442nd brought new resolve and tactical flexibility, their combat reputation already established in some of the fiercest battles of the European campaign.
The assault on Monte Castello began before dawn on January 24, 1945. Both Black and Japanese-American troops advanced in coordination, using the cover of night to mask their movements. German defenders, now wary after the loss of Belvedere, responded with overlapping fields of fire and counterattacks at every opportunity. The fighting was unrelenting, with casualties mounting rapidly on both sides. Night attacks became the tactic of choice, taking advantage of limited visibility and the soldiers' hard-earned experience navigating difficult terrain in darkness. The men advanced silently, carefully placing their feet to avoid triggering mines or alerting German sentries. At dawn, the mountainside was scarred by fresh shell craters and the twisted wreckage of equipment, the line of attack marked by trails of blood in the snow.
For days, the battle seesawed along the summit, with ground won at night often lost again under the force of German counterattacks during the day. Communication was tenuous, and ammunition ran dangerously low. Officers reminded their men that there would be no withdrawal. Monte Castello had to be taken and held at any cost. The burden of expectation, already heavy, grew with every hour of the fight. Individual acts of bravery once again changed the course of battle. Teams of riflemen crawled through withering fire to flank machine gun nests, while engineers raced to clear paths through minefields. The Japanese-American soldiers of the 442nd earned respect from their Black comrades, both groups bonded by a shared determination to prove themselves against both enemy bullets and the prejudice of their own nation.
At last, on February 19, a coordinated night assault broke the stalemate. The 442nd attacked from the north, while the 370th Infantry struck from the east, catching the German defenders off guard. Fierce hand-to-hand combat erupted among the shattered bunkers, but the Americans pressed on, refusing to be thrown back. By sunrise, the battered survivors of both units stood on the summit of Monte Castello, the enemy in full retreat. German commanders, once dismissive, now sent urgent pleas for reinforcements and permission to withdraw. Reports described the attackers as exceptionally determined, fighting with a ferocity that could not be explained by propaganda. The breach at Monte Castello threatened the integrity of the entire Gothic line, forcing the German high command to reconsider its strategies.
The victory was costly. Companies that had started with 100 men were reduced to a few dozen effectives. The mountainside was marked by shallow graves and scattered gear, a silent testament to the price of progress. The faces of the survivors were drawn and hollow, their eyes reflecting the strain of unending battle.
Yet despite the devastation, the capture of Monte Castello marked the true breaking point for the German defenses in the Apennines. The path was now open for Allied forces to surge north, the last strongholds of the Gothic line exposed and vulnerable. The Buffalo Soldiers and the men of the 442nd had achieved together what many believed was impossible. For both Black and Japanese American soldiers, victory meant more than territory gained. It was proof that courage and determination could overcome not only the enemy's guns, but also the barriers of bigotry and doubt. The final break in the line was not just military, it was a fracture in the long history of prejudice carved into the rock of Monte Castello with blood and resolve. As spring approached and the fighting in northern Italy drew to a close, the Buffalo Soldiers of the 92nd Infantry Division looked homeward. The Gothic line had been broken, and the Po Valley was finally open to Allied advance. The men who survived the mountains bore scars both visible and hidden, their stories written across battered uniforms and weary faces. The triumph on those icy ridges, however, could not erase the hardships that awaited them back in the United States. For many, the return home was not a hero's welcome. Instead of parades or open arms, Black veterans faced the harsh realities of segregation and discrimination that had plagued their lives before the war. In southern towns, they were refused service in restaurants and denied access to public spaces. Some were even targeted for violence simply because they dared to wear their uniforms with pride.
The GI Bill, intended to reward returning servicemen, often excluded Black veterans through bureaucratic obstacles or outright denial. Promised opportunities for education, housing, and employment vanished in the face of local prejudice. Many soldiers who had risked everything on the front lines found themselves struggling to secure even the most basic rights at home. The sacrifices made on foreign soil seemed forgotten or deliberately ignored. Stories of injustice circulated among families and communities. A Purple Heart earned on Monte Belvedere did not guarantee a seat at a lunch counter in Georgia or a home loan in Chicago. Some veterans, frustrated and angry, joined early civil rights movements, determined to fight for the freedoms they had been denied despite their service. Others carried their pain in silence, unsure how to reconcile their battlefield valor with the rejection they now faced.
Recognition for the division's achievements came slowly, if at all. Medals and commendations, when they arrived, were often delivered years or decades after the fact. The story of the Buffalo Soldiers faded into the background of a nation eager to move on from the war. Still, within Black communities, their heroism was cherished, a symbol of pride, resilience, and the unbreakable will to demand dignity. The memory of those lost on the mountains lingered long after the guns fell silent. Small memorials and quiet ceremonies on distant ridges stood as reminders of the men who had climbed higher than anyone thought possible. Each name carved into stone was a testament to courage in the face of both enemy fire and institutional scorn. Families held on to photographs and faded letters, refusing to let the world forget what had been achieved.
President Truman's executive order desegregating the military in 1948 owed much to the records set by Black combat units in World War II. The actions of the 92nd Infantry Division proved beyond doubt that ability and valor were never limited by race. Slowly, the country began to change, driven by the stubborn example set by men who had fought 2 wars, one abroad and one at home. For the Buffalo Soldiers, the long shadow of home was both a burden and a legacy. Their struggle did not end with the defeat of the Nazis. Instead, it continued in every courthouse, classroom, and neighborhood where justice was still denied. Yet through their endurance, they helped lay the foundation for the victories of the future. Their journey was marked by hardship and heartbreak, but also by the quiet pride of knowing they had stood firm when the world expected them to falter. The mountains of Italy became sacred ground, not only for those who survived, but for all who still fight for a place in the sun. The laughter that once echoed in enemy bunkers was silenced by men who refused to break.
and in doing so, they changed the world even as the long shadow of home remained.